If you're out house hunting in this crazy market, you've probably heard the phrase, whether mentioned to you by your buyer's agent or your listing agent, waiving appraisal. Today we're going to talk about the pros and cons of waiving an appraisal from both the buyer and the seller side. I'm SandiWarner with Warner Realty Group, and today we're going to talk about the term waiving appraisal. Waiving an appraisal is actually a lot more common right now. During the time of COVID, a lot of people who refinanced over the last 6 months probably were offered a waiver, an inspection or an appraisal waiver. But now what's happening with all these houses that are getting multiple offers, selling way over asking price, a lot of buyers who may have cash, who may have 20, 30, 50, 200,000 in cash, are actually waiving appraisal. What does that mean? If the buyer of your property puts an offer in and they're going to waive appraisal, it usually happens in a condition where that buyer is going to pay cash for the property anyway. And sometimes will happen if they have enough cash, even if they're going to do financing. And what it means is that the buyer assumes the risk of the sale price being higher than the actual appraised value. An appraised value is one conducted by a professional appraiser. It's what tells the bank, if there's a bank involved, how much that property is likely to sell for. As the buyer, your buyer's agent hopefully is experienced and they can look at the comps in the area and tell you what the appraisal should come in at, usually pretty close. And as a seller, you probably had something very similar done for you before you listed the house. So what are the pros and cons of this? If you're the buyer and you can submit your offer with a waiver of appraisal, it's a cleaner offer. You've removed a contingency which will help your offer stand out from the other offers. If you're the seller, also if you're the buyer, if you waive the appraisal, it will lower your cost because you're not paying for the appraisal. For the seller, the value of waiving appraisal is you've removed a contingency. A contingency is a way for a buyer to get out of the contract. So they only have a couple of them in Rhode Island. It's inspections, mortgage, which is contingent on appraisal. And so if you remove those, once you guys go under contract, they don't have any real legal way to get out of the contract. The cons of waiving an appraisal. First of all, for the buyer, make sure your buyer's agent puts a floor in there. I've seen offers coming through that just flat out waive appraisal and had the appraisal come in very low, like much lower than the comps in the area. This can happen. Appraisers are people. It could be a mistake. That can be, what's the word we want? Challenged. It could be, you could say, hey, that's not right. You could go back, but that's a timely process. So if you're like, hey, we're okay if it comes in 20,000, if the appraisal comes in 20,000 less than the sale price, we don't care. We love this house, or 30,000. Know what that number is and make that your floor, so that your offer would say we are waiving appraisals as long as it meets X dollars. The second thing to bear in mind is if you waive appraisal and you're saying I'm going to pay whatever it is, just check yourself. Make sure you're not just competing, that this isn't gambling for you, that you don't have to win at all costs, because you could be overpaying for that house. And there's a lot of indicators that say we're at the top of the market right now, and we should see a leveling off and maybe even a correction downward, which means you're going to be upside down in your house for a longer period of time. So just keep that in mind. The other one could be a liability. If you're an agent, you want to really be careful of how you communicate this to your buyers and your sellers. Sellers, even though they waive appraisal, if they don't have the cash, if your appraisal, if that is so far apart, maybe they can't do it. And then you've got a lawsuit going on because you're trying to force the sale. And the last one is if sellers and buyers, if you are putting a good chunk of change down, buyers, and you've got 200 or 300, you've got 25, 30, 35%, and you're confident that it's going to appraise close enough that you still have a big enough down payment, that seller may say, look, it doesn't matter to me because even though the buyer's waiving the appraisal right, the bank is still going to require it to appraise at a certain value. And then they could get out of the contract on the mortgage contingency. So in other words, seller, if your buyer submits an offer and they have a mortgage contingency, it doesn't matter if they say they're waiving appraisal. The bank is going to appraise the property. So the bank may A, refuse to waive it, or B, not want to work with the client because they don't want the risk. So just take all of that into consideration. If you have any questions about waiving appraisal and things you can do to make your offer stronger, give us a call. It's 401-236-8685. I'm Sandi Warner with Warner Realty Group, making the complex simple.